There are many works of art that depict the encounter between Jesus and Saul on the road to Damascus. Most of them have Saul falling off a horse or camel or a donkey. And I have to admit that some of my colleagues suggested a title for this message that I cannot repeat out loud in church. Something about Saul getting knocked on his, Well, the actual story of Acts of the Apostles says nothing about transportation animals. Saul was a powerful person and probably rode either a horse or a donkey. He was also a young man at this point, an up-and-comer. He was a zealot for his faith. He believed that anything that drew people away from the faith of Judaism must be squashed. He was an educated and personable Pharisee. While most progressive Christians and Jews are at peace with one another now, that wasn't the case in the first century. Many Jewish leaders felt the followers of Christ, or the Way, were a threat to Judaism, and Saul was on it. Saul stood approvingly at the death of the first Christian martyr, Stephen. He had a penchant for dragging women and men out of their houses who were suspected of being part of the Way and putting them on trial. He was into rooting out all those apostates and punishing them severely. And since most of the followers of Jesus at this point were Jews, Saul persecuted his own people, and he was relentless. While Jesus spoke negatively of lukewarm faith, which does not cleanse like hot water or refresh like cold water, there is precedent in all world religions, including ours, against zealotry. Jesus was neither a fanatic nor an uncompromising person. He believed in learning. He believed in listening. He believed that an unchallenged faith would not help one mature. He believed in people coming to a deepening faith because they believed. Saul, on the other hand, was a zealot. It was his way or the highway. And when people looked for more spiritual satisfaction than merely following the laws of Judaism, he took it upon himself to eradicate that kind of searching. In this, he was not a particularly profound person, as most fanatics are not particularly profound. He had heard that the Way had reached into Syria. And so he set out for Damascus, about 60 miles from Jerusalem. He was going to go to the synagogues in Damascus, and Luke says, so that if he found any who belonged to the Way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. But much like Stephen Sondheim's musical, a funny thing happened on the way to Damascus. Saul was traveling along, nearing Damascus, when bam! He fell to the ground. He was knocked over by Jesus, literally. Saul was on the ground, blinded by the divine light, and Jesus called him on his behavior of persecution. Jesus knocked him over, and Saul was never the same again. He did a 180 and became an incredibly faithful apostle of Jesus Christ. Jesus has a way of knocking us off our high horse. His very presence can bring down the arrogant and uplift the humble. Jesus Christ can bring about a glorious impossible. And every maturing Christian experiences that glorious impossible during their lifetime in some way. Well, I openly confess that Jesus often knocks me to the ground when I'm heading in the wrong direction or about to engage in bad behavior. Jesus also lifts me up to work the glorious impossible in my life. When I'm blinded or at a dead end, Jesus shows me another way. When I'm frustrated, Jesus opens another door. When I'm grumpy, Jesus makes me laugh. When I feel that something is impossible, it is Jesus who reminds me that nothing is impossible for those who believe. And Jesus works through me to achieve a glorious impossible in someone else's life. And that is the most beautiful experience of all. Are you able to recognize the glorious impossible in your life? Do you pause and make yourself aware of how God changes you and works through you? Certainly, Saul's story is over the top dramatic. And some of us have those kinds of experiences and tell the story as Saul told the story over and over again. But many of us have less theatrical stories that are just as breathtaking. You grandparents in the congregation, have you shared your faith story with your grandchildren? You aunts and uncles, you friends and acquaintances, you neighbors and co-workers, have you told your story about faith and God opening your eyes to something you could not see before? If you don't tell your story about what God has done for you, how will others know? This is why Luke wrote down the stories of the early church, so that others, maybe even thousands of years later, would know about the glorious impossible. That's why he told how Peter changed his mind about Gentiles and accepted them into the way. And how Philip stopped to talk to an Ethiopian eunuch. That's why he told how fractured and fragile the church can be, and how unity comes by being open to the Holy Spirit. Many of these stories may seem unspectacular all by themselves, but in the great story of faith, they all add up to a glorious impossible. The great story of our faith is about how God works in us. the homemaker, the teacher, the engineer, the truck driver, the factory worker, the social worker, the therapist, the nurse, the sales clerk, the executive, the banker, the lawyer, the cop, the student, the person who answers the phone, and the person who travels to fix things. If you want to live a life of generosity, as the church encourages us to do, tell your story to another person. It will touch people and move them. It would help them look at their own lives and see God in themselves. It may even encourage change in ways that we cannot imagine. Today, we lit the third candle on our Advent wreath for witness. Witness that the Messiah has changed our lives. Witness is not always about having the right answer to a question or being able to quote the Bible or even sharing an opinion. Witness is simply telling our story or part of our story or how God blessed you this day. So what is your story of God's glorious impossible? And have you told anyone lately?